It was a hellhole full of cockroaches and rats. The temperature in the summer created a heated squalor, and in winter, a freezing nightmare. The lights were on 24 hours a day. The food was inedible. The kitchen staff, mostly inmates, put spit, sperm, and feces in his food. The prisoners on the wing banged on their cell doors and screamed they were going to rape or kill him. The prison guards were either incredibly incompetent or just corrupt. Some of them would become convicted rapists, serial sex offenders, drug dealers, and murderers. This was the scene of the last 35 days of Jeffrey Epstein's life. He went from a private jet flying back from Paris with his much younger Byelorussian girlfriend to being arrested and sent to this hellhole. He never came out. And this is the investigation of what actually happened to Jeffrey Epstein inside that jail. Welcome to CrimeWaves. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to CrimeWaves. I'm Declan Hill, an associate professor of investigations here at the University of New Haven. And every episode I work with my students, and this week it's the brilliant Jake Zenger and Alex Klein. And we show you one particular investigation. And on this series, we're looking at what actually happened to Jeffrey Epstein inside that hellhole of a prison. We spent months reading thousands of pages of legal documents, government reports, released internal emails, news media stories. We reviewed videos and books. And we also did a series of astonishing exclusive interviews, all to find the truth of how the most famous prisoner in America died. In this episode, we're going to examine the case of why a reasonable person may believe that Epstein committed suicide. In this episode is the reason why I began our investigation into Epstein's death 2 years ago. America is the country with the highest number of its own people in jail in the world. Even communist China, with its archipelago of concentration camps, detention centers, and gulags, has a lower number of people in jail than America. So if the system here can do what they did to the richest, most well-known inmate in America, they can do it to anyone. So in this episode, you're going to hear evidence that suggests Epstein may have taken his own life. It's all the details that government officials, be they Republican or Democrat, don't want you to know. You'll hear about the appalling, inhumane conditions that the U.S. prison system subjects its inmates to. You'll hear, and this is massive breaking news, previously unrevealed verdicts of a team of top pathologists who reviewed the case, the majority of whom said the wounds on Epstein's neck point towards suicide. To be clear, I'm an investigator. I don't believe that Jeffrey Epstein was murdered, and I don't believe that he committed suicide. What I'm looking for is the truth. I'm one of the last of the old school journalists, and one of the things that I teach my students on CrimeWaves is be independent. Don't have a personal skin, emotion, or favoritism in any investigation that you conduct. So I'm not doing clickbait, partisan hack who's going to tell you some theory just to bolster my ratings. Here's what I believe in. You. I believe in my listeners and viewers. I respect you. And I know that you want me to be intelligent, independent, and that above all, you want me to show you the truth about what happened to Jeffrey Epstein, irrespective of any political bias. So in this series, we are going to show you the facts on either side of the case, homicide or suicide. If you like this approach, if you like the series, if you like the work that myself and my students do, please take a moment now, like, subscribe, follow CrimeWaves. It is massively important to the show. In this episode, in fact, in the entire series, we're going to be dealing with a difficult subject matter, the potential near deliberate driving of one of America's richest men to kill himself. Self-harm is a very difficult subject. So please, if you are in any way considering self-harm, or you're just stuck in one of those nightmares of life that all of us at some point get into, please reach out for help. Every country in the world has a phone number that you can call just to talk things over with a sympathetic person. Here in America and Canada, the number is very simple. 988. That's 988. In the UK, there are a number of national helplines, but the Samaritans, who are excellent, are at 116 123. That's 116 1, 2, 3. The Metropolitan Correctional Center, or MCC, is a short mile from Wall Street in downtown New York. Its official address is 150 Park Row, but there's nothing distinguished about the building. It was built in 1974 with the help of mafia-run cement and construction crews, and it's a very unprepossessing 12-story high-rise. The MCC is not a jail. It's a detention center where prisoners are kept waiting their trial, mostly in the high-profile Southern District of New York court circuit. The MCC was built to house 449 prisoners. But in July 2019, when Epstein entered that prison, it had almost twice as many detainees. Its reputation was terrible. Actually, terrible is an understatement. Everyone knew how awful the MCC was. Quote, MCC has had major screw-ups in the past. It's strange that they put Epstein there. Those are the words of Patrick Dunleavy, the former Deputy Inspector General of New York State Department of Corrections. He told the New York Post that he couldn't understand why Epstein was sent there. However, former MCC prisoners are even less kind in their judgment of their institution. Leverett Fernandini was arrested in a drug raid in 2011. He was kept for years in the MCC awaiting his trial. He was held in the same unit as Jeffrey Epstein. And here's part of his legal complaint against the prison authorities. 1. Plaintiff Leverett Fernandini alleges that while at MCC, he suffered inhumane conditions of confinement and was given inadequate medical attention. First, Mr. Fernandini claims that at least twice during the month of December 2013, there were problems with the plumbing system at MCC, such that sewers from toilets was backed up for days on end. 2, he alleged that inmates were forced to defecate in plastic bags, and that many inmates used the showers as toilets during this time. This led to repulsive conditions that gave the plaintiff headaches, caused his eyes to burn, and led to stomach pains. 3, Mr. Fernandini also alleges that his headaches were caused by the mold, rust, and dust in his unit, all the results of a faulty ventilation system. Finally, Mr. Fernandini notes that the unit was infested with rats and mice. 4, plaintiff alleges that on January 6, 2014, he was bitten by a rat on his arm. The area around Mr. Fernandini's rat bite became infected. His arm was swollen for a period of time, and he experienced a burning sensation and numbness radiating up and down his arm. Now note that when that rat bite occurred, Fernandini had been in the MCC for 2.5 years waiting for his trial. When Julian Assange of WikiLeaks was being held in a British jail, this kind of mistreatment and systematic abuse in the American prison system in general, and specifically at the MCC, played a decisive role in District Judge Vanessa Baltrici's decision to deny the U.S. government's extradition request. Her decision, in part, was bolstered by a case of another WikiLeaks whistleblower, Joshua Schulte. He spent over 5 years in the MCC, and his crime was to reveal to the public that his employer, the CIA, had the capacity to turn Americans' iPhones and Android devices, as well as some of their smart TV devices, into surveillance devices. Before being sentenced to 40 years in jail, Schulte's lawyer wrote both a legal complaint and a sentence hearing appeal that mentioned the conditions inside the MCC. And those legal documents read in part as follows, quote, MCC's treatment of pre-trial detainees is truly abhorrent, unconscionable, cruel, and unusual punishment. Inmates are locked in concrete boxes the size of parking spaces with purposefully obstructed views of the outside. The cages are filthy and infested with rodents, rodent droppings, cockroaches, and mold. There's no heating or air conditioning in the cages. There's no functioning plumbing. The lights burn brightly 24 hours per day, and the inmates are denied outside recreation, normal commissary, normal visitation, access to books and legal material, medical care, and dental care. No matter what crime an individual is alleged to have committed, the United States Constitution grants all a presumption of innocence. Indeed, no American wants to be treated like a caged animal if accused of a crime. Dependent, deserted, dehumanized, demoralized, and detained. Here's the important quote. It's barbaric and inhumane to lock human beings into boxes for years and years. It is a punishment worse than death. And there is no wonder that MCC inmates would rather kill themselves than continue to live in absolute oppression.
Dirty, I remember at that time they still had regular mattresses, filth. They've been pissed on and blood on them, and people were sick on them, and it's pretty disgusting.
For this series, we interviewed two high-level former Mexican drug dealers turned government cooperating witnesses who were kept in the same wing of the Metropolitan Correctional Center's Jeffrey Epstein. This area is called the Special Housing Unit, or SHU. It's for troublesome inmates, either the especially dangerous, the serious killers or gang members, or their exact counterparts, the prisoners who are in that part of the jail because they're in peril, sex offenders, corrupt police officials, or most commonly cooperators like the Mexican drug dealers that we interviewed. You can hear those interviews in episode 5, Rocking the Baby to Sleep, and episode 6, What Jail Life is Actually Like. Now, to be very clear, they were in a myriad of different high-security prisons, and they said without exception that the MCC was the very worst.
There's cockroaches everywhere. The food is the worst thing you could possibly be served, I guess. It gets to the point, remember for me being in the SHU and inmates know that I'm a cooperator, everyone on that floor has some kind of reason to be down there. For Epstein, he had a big, sexual, assault charges, and all these things came to light, which would be a pedophile. He'd be labeled as a pedophile. And the inmates who bring the food down are going to spit on it, put feces on it, and you're kind of always wondering, is this clean?
Few prisoners look back at their time in detention like a happy version of high school. But what made MCC truly appalling were the guards. It wasn't just that the MCC was short-staffed. And remember, this is the prison that had almost twice the number of detainees that it was designed for, but it was chronically short of employees. It was regular practice for the guards to work double or even triple shifts. It was also a nest of corruption. Criminal guards, that's guards who were committing crimes inside the MCC, smuggling like phones, drugs, or gangs, or sexually abusing and raping the inmates and even killing them, had near impunity there. The federal criminal defense lawyers report on their website, quote, media reports indicate that one guard was indicted, now convicted, for raping a detainee. A lieutenant was charged with beating a handcuffed detainee. 3 guards were indicted for smuggling drugs into the institution, and 1 guard was indicted for applying for fraudulent unemployment benefits. In addition, at least 1 inmate was assaulted and required hospitalization, and at least 1 inmate has been murdered at the facility. The Los Angeles Times has reported that the prison, the MCC, is referred to as the Guantanamo of New York. And the New York Times reported that its administrative segregation units have severe security measures. Amnesty International stated that conditions of the MCC fail short of international standards for humane treatment, unquote. Now, I'm not sure which set of international standards Amnesty International is comparing the MCC to, but Joaquim El Chapo Guzman, the Sinaloa drug cartel leader, went mad in there. Or at least that's what his legal defense team maintained. Chapo Guzman was placed in the special housing unit of the MCC, 1 floor above where Epstein was located, in the winter of 2017. He was awaiting trial, but after a few months there, Guzman's mental condition had deteriorated so much that his lawyer, Eduardo Balzero, wrote a letter to the judge in the case. And note, the lawyer didn't argue that Chapo Guzman wasn't a high-powered Mexican drug dealer or criminal. Rather, he wrote that the conditions inside the MCC were so bad that Chapo Guzman, a candidate for one of the toughest criminals in the world, was going mad. And they were requesting a court-approved mental health expert to appraise his capacity. Now, the letter starts with all the problematic conditions of the jail that are affecting Guzman and would affect Jeffrey Epstein. But the letter goes on, and this is a quote that we have the letter from. Counsel has been visiting Mr. Guzman since February and has noticed that during the last month, Mr. Guzman has suffered a marked deterioration in his mental state. This deterioration has manifested itself in his inability to remember people, places, and events. Specifically, he's complained 1, about auditory hallucinations, 2, the government recording his cell, and 3, feeling persecuted, and 4, depression. Counsel has noticed that Guzman has begun repeating himself often and sometimes forgetting where he is and what he's been saying. In addition to his apparent mental decline, Mr. Guzman also suffers from a myriad of physical problems, including constant headaches, ringing in his ears, and throat pain, and none of those symptoms have been addressed. I'm not asking you to feel sympathy for Chapo Guzman or Jeffrey Epstein, but I am pointing out that even a really hardened criminal like Guzman, who had spent years in high-security Mexican prison, was allegedly suffering mental problems months after entering the MCC. And he wasn't the only one. The United Nations Rapporteur on Human Rights, that's the person who goes around the world to investigate conditions in prisons and torture in human rights challenged countries, presumably got on the subway down from the UN headquarters and went to the MCC and toured the facility. And they were shocked. Specifically, they went to that special housing unit where Jeffrey Epstein would be held and declared it, quote, a punitive measure that is unworthy of the United States as a civilized democracy. We know these appalling conditions had an effect on Epstein. He left a note in his prison cell that was discovered after his death. It was a scrawling, handwritten complaint about how badly he was treated in the prison, and specifically by one female guard, Tova Noel, who was in charge of the SHU that night he died. The note reads, quote, kept me in a locked shower for 1 hour. Noel sent me burnt food, giant bugs crawling over my hands. No fun. This is not necessarily a suicide note, but it does indicate Epstein's state of anger and despair at the MCC guards and prison conditions. Here's the deal. Almost everyone inside that Democratic Party, Tammany Hall-inspired judicial infrastructure of New York City knew how bad conditions were inside the MCC. They knew that detention center near their penthouse suites in downtown Manhattan was a hellhole. And almost everyone in Bill Barr's Republican federal Department of Justice knew how bad the MCC was. It was where, until guys like Jeffrey Epstein came along, that they sent poor working class prisoners, innocent or guilty, to sign deals or maybe die. It was a prosecution deal factory. That's a criminal defense lawyer's term. And here's how a prosecution deal factory works. You're arrested for a crime you didn't commit. You're completely innocent, but the authorities place you in an institution like the MCC. You're determined to fight the charges. But on the second day you're in the place, some gangbanger beats the crap out of you or threatens to find your family if you don't start paying the blackmail money, or he just rapes you. A week later, you have a meeting with the prosecution. They slide a piece of paper across the desk and say, hey, sign this paper, say you committed the crime, and we'll argue in front of the judge for you to get 2 years maximum. With good behavior, you'll be out by December of next year. And you say, no way. I'm innocent. I want my day in court. I want a jury to see what happened. And prosecution lawyers, and they're all dressed in their expensive suits, if it's the Southern District of New York, say, hey, man, fantastic, respect, fight the power. Glad to see your faith in the American legal system. However, our court dates are really jammed up at the moment, but we could get you on the fast track and have your trial February 2 years from now. Now, we're going to put you back in the MCC to give you plenty of time to think about our offer. Most people, when confronted with a place like the MCC, are eventually going to give up and sign the piece of paper. And those kind of deals happen all the time. They are the bread and butter of the U.S. legal system. And remember, the Southern District of New York is where all the top-shot criminal lawyers go to make their names. They want high-profile trials, but even more importantly, they want a high number of successful convictions so they can boast about it on their resumes or when they stand for election. And having a hellhole like the MCC to frighten, detain people, innocent or guilty, is a great way for them to keep their numbers up. And look, I'm not saying that all the people in the MCC were innocent. Many were hardened gangsters, but those guys enjoyed their stay there. The MCC was so corrupt, they could do anything they wanted. But it's why all the New York media and judicial establishment, right up to Attorney General Bill Barr, were not surprised that an inmate at the MCC committed suicide. It made their media campaign much more difficult in August 2019. They could not say, well, we know he committed suicide because we kept these detention centers deliberately as hellholes full of corrupt criminal guards. So that's the institution that the authorities sent Jeffrey Epstein into on July 6, 2019. He would only survive it for 35 days.
Saturday, July 6, 2019, 9:37 p.m.
At first, they put Jeffrey Epstein into the general prison population. He shared a dormitory room with 20 other prisoners. And quite why the prison administration would have thought that putting a multimillionaire white sex offender into the general population was a good idea is beyond me. However, as a sign of their all-round incompetency, they managed in Epstein's original intake documentation to get his race and skin color wrong. They put him down as a black man. When the prison governor arrived on Monday morning, a series of meetings were held, and they determined that Epstein should be immediately moved out of the general population, put him in the special housing unit. And they placed him in a cell with a corrupt cop, Nicholas Tartaglione. Actually, to call him a corrupt cop is really an insult to corrupt cops everywhere. Because Tartaglione was not just corrupt, he'd also run a drug smuggling business and then killed or ordered the killing of 4 of his associates by strangling them with a plastic cord. We examined Tartaglione's relationship with Epstein in detail in the first episode of the series, The Case for the Prosecution. It was homicide because, well, Epstein did die from strangulation. However, now let's give the defense side of their relationship. Because first, under prison rules, Tartaglione was actually a pretty good match for Epstein. Remember, American jails are mostly places where racism runs free. There are blacks, whites, and Latinos. And any interchange between those 3 groups can be very difficult. So at least Nicholas Tartaglione and Jeffrey Epstein were the same ethnicity. And as a corrupted cop, Tartaglione was also just as hated as a multimillionaire sex offender. He was also a large, muscular man who could potentially help protect his bunkie. Tartaglione also hated the MCC. 4 months earlier, in February 2017, he'd been beaten, allegedly by other prisoners, so badly that they had to reconstruct his eye socket. And he complained about it for over 2 years about how bad the prison was. Now, most prisoners do the same thing, but in this case, the judge in his murder trial, Kenneth Carras, agreed with him, and he threatened to hold the government in contempt of court because the conditions inside the MCC were so bad. So the government put Jeffrey Epstein and this man, Nicholas Tartaglione, together in a small room. And 16 days later, Jeffrey Epstein allegedly tried to commit suicide. We're going to examine that incident, giving this time Tartaglione's view of what happened that night. But before that, a brief word about CrimeWaves and our philosophy of investigations. Hey, it's Declan here. Look, I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm an investigator. If some of my viewers and listeners want to hold my feet to the fire and force me to tell you my general view of the 2 U.S. political parties, Democrats, Republicans, I choose the Mercutio option from Romeo and Juliet, and I would say a plague on both their houses. I don't mean the voters. I don't mean their supporters. I mean the leaders in Washington, D.C. The decay and destruction those two political parties have brought to this country leaves me disgusted. So in this investigation of Jeffrey Epstein's death in prison, we aren't motivated by some political angle or partisan clickbait stuff. I and my student team are independent investigators. We're just going through the evidence to bring you the truth. If you like that approach to top investigations and you enjoy the series, please, I beg you, take a moment, like, subscribe, or follow the show. We're available on YouTube, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. Or if you prefer reading, then please join us on Substack, Declan Hill, at CrimeWaves, where you'll find lots of articles and background material on the show. Thank you. Now back to the episode.
The Curious Incident. Tuesday, July 23rd, 2019. 1:27 a.m.
Something happened in that prison cell, Z05124, that night. At exactly 1:27 a.m., Nicholas Tartaglione started banging on the cell door and screaming to the guards that Epstein had woken Tartaglione up by falling on him with something tied around his neck. Jeffrey Epstein would at first, after he was taken out of the cell and placed in another wing, claim that he'd been attacked by Tartaglione, who tried to strangle him. Tartaglione and his lawyer, on the other hand, claimed that he had saved Epstein's life. If he had not alerted the guards, Epstein would have died. And furthermore, they reasoned, if Tartaglione had attacked Epstein, why would he have called the guards? Surely it would have been better not to say anything. Now, the prison staff psychologist, or one of them, wrote a report after the death. And in it, they said that there were three possible scenarios for the incident. One, Nicholas Tartaglione had tried to kill or at least attack Jeffrey Epstein for reasons unknown. Two, Jeffrey Epstein had tried to kill himself. And three, that Tartaglione and Epstein had conspired together to fake the attack so that Epstein would be moved out of a solitary cell to one with better living conditions. Now, it should have been relatively easy to clear this matter up. The MCC cameras were at that time still functioning and recording. However, almost unbelievably, considering all the significance of what would occur to the most famous prisoner in America, the MCC prison authorities deleted the tapes so no one could see what had happened. And no one seemed to have taken photos of Epstein's wound or examined Nicholas Tartaglione's hands for any potential wound or cut. As for Jeffrey Epstein, he was transferred to the suicide watch cell, where he was kept for the next 6 days.
The Suicide Watch, July 23rd to 30th, 2019.
The suicide watch cells inside the MCC resembled a badly painted Salvador Dali nightmare combined with absolute poverty. U.S. justice officials like to claim that their system is humane and first world. They really care about the accused and their institutions. The reality? There was only one full-time psychiatrist for 2 detention centers in New York City, and both of those places were overcrowded and jammed with more than 2,000 troubled inmates. As for the MCC suicide watch, it didn't consist of counseling or therapy. There was no lying on couches and contemplating past mistakes or relationships, no intense psychotherapy, nor was there even any prescription medicine to alleviate mood or distress. What they did was pay other inmates $1 an hour to watch the potential suicidal inmate through a screen for 24 hours a day. The inmate would lie on the floor. There were no sheets, no bedding, no blankets, nothing that could give them either comfort or help someone kill themselves. There are reports of Epstein's conversations with some of the other inmates who were watching him. One of them said that he had a pleasant chat about driving New York taxis, something that Epstein claimed he'd done as a young man. But what also emerges consistently from the reports is the lack of sleep that Epstein had. He was dozing, or at least trying to doze, for at most half an hour to 45 minutes. Then he'd get up, and remember, the lights were on 24 hours a day, and be back talking to the other inmates or just staring at the walls. After 6 days, or nearly 6 days of that surveillance, the counselor had another meeting with Epstein. David Schoon, one of Jeffrey Epstein's lawyers who we spoke to, witnessed the conversation. It was brief, and Epstein laughed at the idea of him being suicidal. So he was then released from suicide watch. He was placed back in the SHU, and it was to be this last week of being alive.
The last week, August 2nd to 9th, 2019.
Jeffrey Epstein was placed now in cell number Z06220 of the L tier unit of the Special Housing Unit. He shared that cell with a new bunkie, a man who just turned cooperating witness to reduce his prison time. And when Epstein went into the cell, he immediately asked Epstein not to kill himself. Epstein laughed and said not to worry about it. That was just about the only pleasant moment that Epstein had on the wing. There were near constant shouts and threats coming through the walls from the other prisoners. And this was to be Jeffrey Epstein's life. No more private jets and apartments in Paris. No more meetings at expensive restaurants with his buddy Harvey Weinstein. No more nice Manhattan townhouses and business deals with the former Israeli prime minister. Just inedible food, dirt, and death threats. And at that point, Jeffrey Epstein made a new will. Why? The version from the people who believe it was homicide is that he was in good spirits with a winnable legal case and the top lawyers in America fighting for him. Okay. So if that's the complete scenario, why did Epstein take time in the middle of a hellhole prison, fighting to get out of it, to make himself a new will? Why did he shift all his assets into a trust if he didn't have some idea of getting out of that prison in a body bag? And let's also speak of his chances of getting out of jail on bail. He and his brother, Mark Epstein, and friends allegedly put up the biggest bail in the history of the American legal system, something over $200 million. Their bail plan was that Epstein would be under house arrest in his 7-story Manhattan mansion while he awaited trial. The guards would be paid by Epstein, and he would wear an ankle bracelet. It would cost him a lot of money, but he'd be out of prison. Yeah, that was never going to happen. Quote, "It is unfair for wealthy prisoners to buy their way out of prison by constructing their own private jail," unquote. Those were the words of U.S. District Judge Richard Berman. He was in charge of the Jeffrey Epstein case. Berman had presided over another criminal case, that of the Turkish-Iranian gold trader Reza Zarrab, who was also detained at the MCC. His legal team had put together a similar idea for their client. Berman had rejected it. He said that there should not be one form of detention for poor prisoners and one for rich. So it was very unlikely that he would do a Kash Patel 180-degree turn and change his mind.
The last day, August 9th, 2019, 8 a.m.
August 9th, 2019 was not a good day for Jeffrey Epstein. He spent most of it in a room with his lawyers, a small, dingy meeting room that his life was now confined to. At noon, a vast swath of documents relating to Jeffrey Epstein's sexual life and crimes was released in a related case involving his former girlfriend and confidant, Ghislaine Maxwell. And now his private life was once again the front pages of every tabloid website in the world. The world now knew his reading list of sexually motivated books and all his similar Amazon purchases. The world knew of his trail of other encounters with women and girls. And if there were any MCC inmates who had not remembered the Epstein case before this day, they would now. More worryingly, it was not a great context to try and seek bail. The hearing for that appeal would be the next week, but Judge Richard Berman would, unless living under a rock, spend much of his weekend hearing more scandals and stories about Epstein. Now, judges are supposed to be independent. They're supposed to make up their own minds on the judicial evidence before them. But any legal official reading the headlines of that weekend would know very well what the reaction would be if he promptly released Jeffrey Epstein to the confines of his upscale Manhattan mansion. And even more worryingly for Jeffrey Epstein, there may have been materials in the Maxwell case that implicated Epstein in activities that had not been covered in his original prosecution deal in Florida, where Epstein had served prison time. Because in August 2019, the major lifeline for the Epstein legal team had been the judicial principle that a person can't be charged twice for the same set of crimes. And now, with the Maxwell revelations, there was a chance that other activities may have emerged that would put Epstein under further legal damage. Michael Wolff, the investigative journalist and Epstein biographer, had written to him to ask how he was doing. The reply came back that day, August 9th, through one of Epstein's legal team. Quote, "Oh, I'm still hanging around," unquote. Haunting words for what would happen that night.
The last night, August 9th, 2019, 7 p.m.
At approximately 7 p.m., Jeffrey Epstein got back to his wing of the Special Housing Unit. And almost immediately, he asked and was given permission to make a phone call, unmonitored from the shower area of the unit. Now, that sounds simple, but it would take volumes to list all the things that were not supposed to happen in those actions. Look, inmates of the SHU were never supposed to get unsupervised phone calls. You remember Chapo Guzman's complaint about cruel and inhumane conditions inside the SHU. Well, one of the reasons for his anger was that in the years he'd been kept in the SHU, Guzman had never been allowed to talk to his wife or family. Now, other less high-profile prisoners were granted one phone call a month to speak to their families. Yet Epstein was not only allowed a phone call, the guards dialed the number for him on one of their prison phones and then took the phone with them to the shower and left him there alone with it. It's part of a litany of non-investigated actions on the part of the Department of Justice and Bureau of Prisons that no one has been charged for that call. However, at CrimeWaves, we did speak to one former inmate of the MCC who put the price of that call at least $1,000 in a potential bribe that Epstein might have had to pay someone on the MCC staff to do it. Again, no one seems to have investigated outgoing payments or transfers by Epstein or his financial staff to prison guards or anyone connected with it. We're supposed to believe, because of this non-investigation, that the MCC staff, completely against type, were merely soft-hearted characters who were trying to help Epstein out of the goodness of their own hearts. Whatever their motive, Epstein had an unsupervised call. Unbelievably, what happened during that last phone call of Jeffrey Epstein's life has never been properly investigated. The Bureau of Prison Investigators were able to determine that the call, put through a New York line, actually went to Minsk, Belarus. And it connected to Epstein's longtime girlfriend there, Karina Shuliak. However, what happened during that call has never been officially explained. Karina Shuliak claimed through her lawyers that the conversation was good and that she was completely bewildered by the news of his death the next day. We don't have any evidence to suggest that's not true. But a cynic might say, That's exactly what any normal person who doesn't want to be hounded for the rest of their life because they broke off with their boyfriend in prison and they committed suicide the next day would say. And I want to emphasize, I don't know if that happened, but I do want to say that Karina Shuliak has never been subpoenaed to sit down for an official interview. Because even if the phone call was a good one, that too could have been a suicide motivation for Jeffrey Epstein if he'd been thinking, what if I never see this woman again? And it's all part of the extraordinary bad series of investigations around the entire Epstein file that no official has ever spoken to her directly.
The Last Walk, August 9th, 2019, 7:49 p.m.
On the reported video released by the Department of Justice a couple of weeks ago, we see Jeffrey Epstein walking towards his cell. His regular bunkie, the man who'd begged him not to commit suicide, had been taken out of the unit. And it was the first time since July 6th, when he entered the MCC, that Jeffrey Epstein was alone. If he were to kill himself, if he were to escape life in that hellhole, that night would be almost his only opportunity to do so. So Jeffrey Epstein is seen on video walking across the unit with a couple of guards. And it's the last time anyone would ever see him alive. What happened in his cell that night of August 9th and 10th, murder or suicide, is still shrouded in mystery.
The Aftermath, August 10th, 6:33 a.m.
As Michael Thomas, one of the guards on Epstein's unit who had discovered his body, was bent over him in his cell, frantically doing CPR and potentially destroying any chance of recovering evidence from the death scene, even as Thomas was doing this, desperately shouting at Epstein's corpse, "Breathe, Epstein, breathe," many of the rest of the inmates in the SHU were chanting, mocking Jeffrey Epstein in his death and the incompetent prison system that kept them locked up. Breathe, Epstein, breathe. It's a good indication of the attitude of the fellow prisoners about his death, because only one of the prisoners on that wing that night agreed to be interviewed by the investigators. Their testimony neither directly contradicted nor confirmed suicide or homicide, but it did contradict some of the evidence presented by the prison guards. However, none of the other prisoners either agreed to speak to the investigators or was invited to do so. And it's another strange mystery in a seemingly never-ending litany of investigative incompetence. Nor was the SHU locked down, which is standard practice in most prisons after suspicious deaths or attacks. The inmates' hands and feet are examined for potential marks and wounds to see if they might have been involved in a fight or attack.
There's always some sense of a trophy that this, look at his name. The whole world knows his name. I think that someone like marketing for death or like doing the deed would really let everyone know he did it.
So if an inmate had killed Epstein 5 years ago, we would have heard about it. Maybe not that week, maybe not that month, but somehow somebody would have talked about it.
He's a trophy. Imagine it's like someone killed a cooperator with that much status.
Right,
like you. What do you call it? Let's just use Whitey Bulger.
Right.
They cut his tongue out. You know who did it. Why? Because they're saying, look, that's what you get for being a cooperator. And that's what we do to them. They weren't afraid of being caught. For that part, I feel like it's kind of surprising that no one's come out and said, hey, this person told me he killed Epstein. That's a get out of jail free card for someone.
Those are the words of the former drug dealer who spent almost a year inside the special housing unit of the MCC. And it's a powerful argument for a verdict of suicide in the Jeffrey Epstein case. No one has come forward in 6 years to say anything about what happened that night in the SHU. Every prisoner is always looking for a way to get out of prison by arbitraging information. Even the people locked up in that unit that night should have spoken to someone in the prison. Surely with such a powerful incentive, someone would talk, even if they'd heard second, third hand about something suspicious that night. But no one has ever spoken.
The Autopsy of Jeffrey Epstein. Sunday, August 11th, 10 a.m.
It was a hot summer day in New York City. Two medical pathologists met to conduct a 4-hour autopsy on Jeffrey Epstein's body. One was the relatively junior Dr. Kristen Roman. She had presumably drawn the short straw in the office politics pool and got a summer weekend when most people would prefer to be at the beach or anywhere but the sweltering city. The other medical examiner in the room that day was from the very far end of the fame spectrum. His name was Dr. Michael Baden. And just about every major celebrity death case over the last 50 years in America has, in some way or another, featured his work. From the O.J. Simpson, Nicole Brown, Ron Goldman murders, to the Attica prison riots, to the case involving Marlon Brando's son, to Floyd George, Dr. Baden has been in demand, searching for clues and medical evidence to provide light in high-profile deaths. The autopsy was conducted politely. There was no tension between the two medical professionals that day. However, the aftermath turned the Jeffrey Epstein case on its head. Because Dr. Kristen Roman, the government pathologist, wrote that day that her verdict for cause of death was, quote, undetermined. Dr. Michael Baden, hired by Mark Epstein, Jeffrey's brother, claimed that it was more likely to have been a homicide. At CrimeWaves, we interviewed Dr. Baden in episode 4 of this series of the Epstein files, and he's passionate to this day he got the case right. And not for the first time, his view put him up against the official establishment line, because Dr. Roman passed her case notes up to her superior, Dr. Barbara Sampson, who's the New York City's chief medical examiner. And 5 days later, Dr. Sampson declared Epstein's death a suicide. There, the two camps entrenched in. Dr. Baden has not withdrawn a syllable of his declaration that Jeffrey Epstein probably died as a result of homicide. With no crime scene evidence, most of it was destroyed and disturbed, Dr. Baden's declaration is a mammoth piece of evidence for those who believe that Epstein's death was murder. However, and this is big news, huge news, in 2024, Mark Epstein in the New York Post, owned by Rupert Murdoch, who also owns Fox News, commissioned a report by 6 senior medical examiners to review the autopsy evidence and select whom they thought was most likely to be right. The government officials who declared it a suicide, or the lone but very senior medical expert, Dr. Michael Baden. And we at CrimeWaves have obtained a copy of that report. And this is, again, huge news, because those independent medical pathologists declared Baden was probably wrong and the New York City medical examiner was probably right. They declare it was a suicide. It's a sign of how publicized and politicized the Epstein debate has become that this is not major news story. The New York Post has reported on the findings, but not with the kind of banner headlines that you might expect if the medical examiners had found the opposite and that it had been a probable homicide. Let me read you some of the opening paragraphs of the report. The panel consists of 6 senior forensic pathologists with a combined experience of over 200 years and tens of thousands of autopsies. All members of the panel have been directors, chief medical examiners, or chief forensic pathologists of offices at some point during their career. Most have significant academic credentials as well and have collectively authored or co-authored hundreds of peer-reviewed articles in academic journals. We have reviewed the material provided and concur with Dr. Roman in her evaluation at autopsy. The anatomical findings are consistent with a suicidal hanging. Panel members varied in their certainty, primarily based on the contextual evidence surrounding the treatment of Mr. Epstein in the MCC. Okay, here's the score of medical pathologists on the Epstein death. of the two professionals who actually examined Jeffrey Epstein's body, one thinks it's murder, the other was undetermined. Of the 7 other professionals who did not examine Jeffrey Epstein's body, but looked at the documents and photos taken from the autopsy, 5 think it was suicide, and 2 think the death should be classified as undetermined. So altogether, of all the pathologists, 1 thinks it's murder, 3 is undetermined, and 5 professionals who think it's most likely suicide. Here's the sad truth about many suicides. The friends, family, and colleagues of the person just cannot believe that the person killed themselves. There is, despite the myth, rarely a note or explanation. At CrimeWaves, we spoke to a number of death investigators about this case, and they all said this was the common feature about deaths from self-harm. The only thing that brings certainty is physical evidence. And in the Jeffrey Epstein case, much of that physical evidence has been destroyed or is inconclusive. The physical evidence was destroyed because the investigations were mostly terrible. But just because the investigation was incompetent and the Attorney General of the time, Bill Barr, was conflicted and the verdict was very convenient for the government and their rich pals, doesn't mean it wasn't suicide. So in this episode, we hope we've shown you clearly and carefully the multitude of factors that may have brought one of the richest men in New York City to kill himself in a hellhole of a prison. On the next episode of CrimeWaves, it's the final one of the series. It's the biggest one. It's the summation of all that we as a team have discovered about Jeffrey Epstein's death. There's going to be a number of exclusive, shocking stories. And we've traced how a killer could have been on the floor of Epstein's prison wing that night, because someone was certainly recorded and documented as having been there. Hey, thank you on behalf of my students, Jake Zenger, Alex Klein, and myself for listening to this episode of the Jeffrey Epstein Files. We are CrimeWaves. We give you independent, intelligent investigations with no spin, no bias, no political partisanship. And if you like that approach, careful, methodical, precise, please, I beg you, take some time, subscribe, like, follow the program, or just send us a comment. We read all your notes, your letters. Some of the time it makes the students' days. So please do so. And we thank you, and we'll see you for the final episode of the Jeffrey Epstein Files.